one of the things that has been achieved is that, what we're saying is that people can live in, the term is people can live in harmony with nature. If you look at all the ways you can go, you can visit a national park and get in touch with biodiversity. You can go harvest mushrooms or things. But what's the activity that puts you in daily contact with nature where your life is completely dependent? Often it's agriculture or people that live in these agroforestry systems. So the stakes there are much higher and the relationship is much more intimate. And we often find that people, particularly, and I'm talking not about large agro-industrial farms, but the kinds of people that the CGIAR works for, which is a small farming families, they're the ones that are in this intimate relationship with biodiversity, and they do have an understanding that their livelihoods and their future welfare depends on maintaining these services, on maintaining the resilience of their ecosystem. And so that's been one of the realizations that has come through in the last COP and is now being acted upon in this one. So this whole Tree Diversity Day, we're not talking about trees in the forest per se, we're talking about those trees that are providing benefits, that are planted by people. And so this is really where we're at, is how these systems of production depend on biodiversity and are at the same time providing a buffer. And a lot of things that ecologists and conservationists talk about is the need for corridors and connectivity. Because there's no point having a little spot of biodiversity there locked up and surrounded by a farm growing GMO soybeans and insecticides, because if the frog has to migrate because of climate change, he'll never make it across 5 kilometers of GMO soybeans. He'll die in the process. So the type of agriculture we're talking about, agroforestry, small-scale farming, provides a corridor and connectivity between spaces. And there's been some interesting work, for example, on shade coffee and or shade cacao in West Africa and Central America, often funded by bird watchers themselves, BirdLife International. You know how passionate these people are. Birders are nuts over birds. And what they find is that there's sometimes these small-scale farms using agroforestry provide better habitats for migratory bird species than the forests themselves, so that you can find more birds that are protected, that are threatened and we want to protect in these areas. So we're finding that certain types of agriculture performs an important function in biodiversity conservation, and sometimes as good, if not better in some cases, for certain species. So we need to have this mix of sustainable agriculture and conserved areas, and that's what we're trying to achieve today, and that goes for aquaculture, agroforestry, and small-scale farming.
How damaging have large-scale farms been to the biodiversity program? I mean, when you look at farms in Europe and the USA, absolutely enormous, just fields of rolling wheat. I mean, how dangerous are they? How detrimental are they to, as you said, the local bird populations and your frogs and your toads?
Well, I mean, I don't think it's not disputable that they're not good at all for biodiversity, and in fact, I would probably. Many of these areas that had a lot of diversity, for example, the plains of North America, the wheat and corn belt, is a center of origin for one of the most important crops in the world, which is the sunflower. Sunflower is grown everywhere now, and it's an important crop, but it originated there. But we have hardly any wild relatives of sunflower left in these areas because that whole original landscape has been so transformed. So if we ever need these original genes, they'd be tough to find. So there's certain tragedies like that are going to be hard to replace. But if I may turn your question and pose it from the other angle, is it good for agriculture? And what they're finding is that even in the so-called corn belt of the ever popular Iowa, for example, they eliminated a lot of these riparian corridors, which riparian forests. They eliminated these wild patches. They eliminated orchards that farmers used to keep. And it became what Michael Pollan, who's a famous writer on food culture, and they became food deserts. The breadbasket of the world is a food desert. There's nothing to eat there if you drive through, nothing you could actually go and pick and munch. So what happens is that by eliminating these patches of biodiversity, farmers were obliged to keep using ever increasing amounts of pesticides. The soil was not regenerating, because soil requires spores of mycorrhiza that often live in that are harbored in wooded areas. So they weren't recolonizing the soil. So with every generation, the soil was becoming poorer and poorer. So even in those areas, interestingly enough, the governor of Iowa, his name is Tom Vilsack, who's now Secretary of Agriculture in the U.S., we were talking, and he proposed, and he had this program for set-asides, that let's restore the original prairie riparian corridors. Let every farm, you get a subsidy by keeping a patch of wild prairie in there. And at first, the farmers were doing it for the typical reason, cash money, bling bling. But then they discovered that, in fact, by keeping these patches of wild in their farms, they were using less pesticide, they were getting better quality soil. And so what we're increasingly seeing is that biodiversity is good also in production, even in intensive areas at the extreme. But for the kinds of people that we work for in the CGIAR, the small-scale farmer, it's not a choice. It really, you depend on biodiversity and intimately, and you keep these mosaics. People use the term now, these farms are really not just like you were describing, this uniform landscape, but it's a mosaic with an orchard, a wild patch, a home garden, and it's a gradation. And when you have that mosaic, you have a bit of resilience. And like any mosaic, if you divide it up and take the pieces out, you don't see the whole. You have to keep the whole, or all you see is little bits of. And so that, I think this conference here is about. Lots of people have been using the term landscape mosaics and forestry mosaics, and that's what we want to do. It makes life more interesting. It makes even farming, and but it involves a whole change in the relationship between biodiversity and agriculture, which I think has been achieved largely now in the last 2-3 conference of the parties, and that's very encouraging to see.
And on a final point, Indian experts I've spoken to out here in farming say there's increasing pressure from the government on farmers to join together, to form larger cooperatives, to form those big mega farms that we've been talking about. What would be your message to them if they go down that route? Is it a case of, fine, have the big farms, have the big fields, and make sure you have these corridors, otherwise, in the longer term, it'll come back to sort of bite you?
Well, I mean, that's my personal belief, but I think you've hit upon essentially what is the core debate at the moment. And some people define this debate using this term land sparing, land sharing. Can we combine biodiversity and productive activities on the same land, or do we try to intensify certain bits of land and spare the others for conservation? Now, I personally happen to be a believer in the land sharing, because I don't even think it's good for agriculture in the end. You tend to get food that is less healthy. You tend to get ecosystems that are dangerous for the workers that work there. You tend to get all kinds of negative impacts that I think people all over the world, North and South, they're increasingly concerned about the quality of their foods. They're concerned about the taste. They want to know where their food comes from. And I think these large concentration of agro-industrial production systems, I'm not sure if their economies are going to be sustainable over the long term. They've done well because fertilizers are subsidized, because petroleum industry is kicking a lot of stuff in. But I don't know if those subsidies weren't there, if that would be a logical and even a rational economic choice. So there's a lot of policymakers, policies that have to be changed. And maybe if we could probably say, do you really need to spend money subsidizing petroleum companies for fertilizer to give to farmers? Maybe if they had to work with nature as it is, they could come up with creative solutions on their own using biodiversity. I personally am a believer in human ingenuity because I see it in so many of the landscapes I travel around the world. I see incredible solutions. I see, rice being grown at 3,200 meters elevation, where I say there's no way rice can grow up in that altitude with that cold, and yet it does.
Where?
in Nepal, and these, and then you say, what kind of rice is it? Well, it's rice with tremendous nutritional properties. They call it medicinal rices. That was a new term to me, but you find this ingenuity all over the world in these landscapes. And so I would rather put my trust in the farmer and let them come up with and find policies that can support their ingenuity and their production systems, rather than have them be sort of led by policies of a need of industry to, and we know there's a lot of waste in agriculture already. It's very wasteful in the use of water, agrochemicals, overspraying. These are the kinds of issues that I think a biodiversity perspective might at least allow policymakers to do the full costing. I don't think the costing has been entirely honest.